Our subject is evangelism, and evangelism in an increasingly secular, pluralistic Western society in particular. And I think I should start, though we're not all Americans here, and we're also not all pastors here, but I think I should confess the sins of of American pastors. In the past, we have known that evangelism is not the most time-efficient and effective way to grow our churches, so we just have not worked at it. We know that great preaching and great music and great youth ministry, all those things are ways of gathering a crowd, and you can grow your church a lot faster, and we have done very little in the way of thinking that much about evangelism. Of course, we have to do evangelism too. The days are increasingly over, though it depends on where you are. And we never should have basically look to marketing rather than evangelism to grow our churches, but we were able to do it in a number of ways. Partly it's one of the sins of American culture, one of the idols that we can fall into, is also because America is really one of the last places in Christendom where you still had a lot of people who felt like, I ought to go to church. Those days are over, and it's quickly coming over, and one of the reasons we're here is to start to get ourselves ready to say, okay, in the future, where are we, how are we going to learn how to do evangelism in our increasingly secular society? The folks we have here are people who are going to be able to tell us a lot about how to do that. Two of the three, we have a British guy who's going to talk to us about the future, which of course most Americans realize that whatever happens in Europe seems to get over to us about 20 years later. We have one American guy, we have Erik Raymond, we have Rico Tice, and we have Becky Pippert, who's actually been all around the world and can really in some ways contrast doing evangelism in various parts of the world. So I'm going to start by asking Becky a question. Becky, some years ago, wrote Out of the Salt Shaker. I won't say how many years ago, because neither of us need to remember how many years ago that was. However, Out of the Salt Shaker became the basis for a lot of conferences, and you have gone all around the world to train people to do evangelism in conferences. Are those what's the fruit of those things? Why are they important? Why are they necessary? Are they necessary? What have you seen as the fruit of such conferences?
I began my ministry in student ministry with InterVarsity eons ago at Reed College in Portland, Oregon. Did 5 years of student ministry, and then rode Out of the Salt Shaker in my late 20s, and then that of course changed my life, and I began to do church ministry. And my passion has always been how, both as an evangelist and an evangelism trainer. Then got married, had children, stopped the kind of constant travel, raised the children, then our last child left, and then my husband and I began ministering together in evangelism. Here's the thing I find remarkable. We have done evangelism, motivating, training, as well as the work of the evangelist on every continent, over and over and over again. Yes, there are some great differences, but the remarkable thing is how similar it is. What I have seen, no matter where we are, is one, probably the thing I hear the most. I would witness. I really want to, but I just am so inadequate. And of course, immediately what I'm thinking, hello, what does the Apostle Paul say? When he saw his weaknesses and inadequacies and realized God was glorified through them, he celebrated his inadequacy. So I disconnect. And of course, what I'm listening to when people are telling me the problems, obviously this has shaped all the training, the teaching that we do. Inadequacy, fears. Everybody has the same fears. You would think they would vary. They don't vary. It's always What if they ask me a question I can't answer? I don't know, I'm shy. What if I offend? What if I'm rejected? The fears are absolutely consistent. And in the talk and I've learned that in training, you've got to give a talk very quickly on fears. And do you know what we discovered as we would have everybody tell us our fears? Do you know what the fear is underneath all the other fears? It's a God problem. Most of evangelism is a God problem, actually. The God problem was, I don't think God's going to come through. I'm going to be out there on a limb. And what if God doesn't come through? God can't use me in my weakness. So whether it's the sense of inadequacy, the fears, always a terrible understanding, an unbiblical understanding of evangelism. Either it used to be memorizing a technique that you would impose on some poor victim, or what's more likely today is, I'm just friendly, and I hope they catch on. Evangelism is so often perceived as an event and not a lifestyle. When Tim came and did the Cambridge, you did Cambridge first. I'm trying to remember what year that was. Do you remember? At Cambridge, not the two Oxford, but the first Cambridge. He did a mission.
It was Passion for Life. I went to the Corn.
2012.
Yeah, it was 2010. Anyway, yes.
See, that's what I thought. That's when we went over. We had been doing global ministry for about 5 years. Felt a real call to come to Europe, and we began ministering in Europe. In the UK and in Europe. I came right after Tim had done the Cambridge mission to Cambridge University. This was the giveaway. I asked the students, how did it go? Fantastic. Tim Keller is unbelievable. Now, I wonder what the organizers are going to do in evangelism next year. And I went, oh my gosh, if that's the way they look at evangelism, an event, no matter how you get the best of the best, I don't care. You got to have a strategy. And you need training to start the mission and follow up. That's what was lacking. That's what we began doing in Europe. So what did I do in terms of, and what did Dick and I do is we began this global ministry as well as across America. I think when you're training in evangelism, one of the things that you need is to recognize our theology is what impacts our methodology. So if you've got somebody who's got a problem with saying, I'm just inadequate, look at the doctrine of the incarnation. The birth of Christ is what we need to understand God's glorified in weakness. What about the people that don't have any sense of the importance of relationship? Do the life and ministry in the doctrine of the incarnation. What do we see in Jesus? Radically identified, yet radically different. We need to do the big talks in order to help them understand why our theology impacts our methodology. But that's only one part. The second part is we need to be practical. See, this is the thing you can't do on Sunday morning. You can't usually stop, give them an exercise, and help them. How do we articulate the gospel? How do we make the gospel biblically faithful, culturally relevant? How do we bring up the topic of faith? How do we go from a natural conversation to a spiritual one? That requires training. That's something you can't do as readily in a church. So you need theology and impacts methodology, you need the practical, and you need prayer. One of the difficulties so often is that people don't understand the power of the Word of God and the power of the Holy Spirit. So I'll stop there.
The trouble is, Becky, the two things that would be the easiest would either be, here's a little canned presentation at the one end, or I'm just being friendly. Both of those are a lot easier than what you're talking about. Just be friendly, and you don't have to say anything about Christ. Just be friendly and tell them you go to church. Or on the other end, here's a little presentation.
Yes.
What you're talking about, it does take training.
Yes.
Tell you what, getting on through here so we can get to other questions. Rico, you come from a rainy place, London, where, and I do, we're not, obviously it's not exactly true, but it's largely true that that Europe got secular before Canada and Australia got secular before America. In other words, it does seem to be a kind of rolling dynamic going on there. And so I know I learned a lot about how to do evangelism in a place like New York by listening to British speakers and preachers who had ministered in London earlier. And so, question, do you have any, since you're in a sense you're a man who's coming from the future, through the time portal, stepping out of your TARDIS, and you're about to say to us, here are some lessons maybe you could be learning here that I have learned in a pretty secular city for doing evangelism.
Yeah, I think that for a long time London churches thought if you just get the events in the calendar, so 3 times a year you run a course or whatever, you have some guest events and guest services running to that, actually you'll get a stream of people that come on the courses. We run Christianity Explored, go through Mark's Gospel, they come to faith. What we're finding now with the culture hardening, that when it comes to running an event, let me do a visual aid because it's early morning, it used to be your friend comes along, they hear the talk and they drop themselves into the course. They just make their own way there. Now, if you bring your friend along at Christmas, or whatever time of year, Christmas is the easiest ask, you bring them along, you give them to the speaker for 25 minutes as he speaks. The moment he finishes, you've got to take your friend back and say, do you want to have a look at, Becky's material, Uncovering the Life of Jesus, has been brilliant in terms of trying to help people do this, and say, do you want to look at the Bible with me? And we're at the point now where we're almost saying, if you're running events without the church family engaging with that one-to-one work with their friends, because the culture's hardening, the events become less and less effective in terms of seeing people on Christianity Explored or Alpha or whatever it is. We're finding it much harder to get people on courses, which has been our strategy, without the personal work happening. So, and I think the reason for that is, what Christians believe is becoming more and more unpleasant to the culture. We believe Jesus is the only way to God. We believe there is a judgment to come. We believe there is a place called hell, and that's why Christ had to die. And therefore, you've got to get people who are good at the one-to-one stuff or the one-to-two stuff, articulating that before their friends will find their way onto courses. So I think that's the change. It's the pen illustration. They used to come and drop themselves on. When Billy Graham came to Haringey 1954-55, 40,000 people went forward at Haringey, but 90% of them were churchgoers.
Yeah, right.
Now, we're so much further away, there needs to be far more relational stuff and the ability to say, okay, let's look at the Bible together, personally, privately, and then they'll find their way onto a course or whatever it is and into church life. So I think it's the mobilization of the church family in terms of one-to-one, which is huge. And the problem with that is people think it's the pastor's job to do that one-to-one stuff or one-to-two stuff. Right. It's not my job. That's the elephant in the room. Yeah. It's the pastor's job. And if we can't change that, the pastors are going to have breakdowns, and the individuals in the churches, they'll spend their whole life on trellis work. They'll be doing the trellis, the sort of structural stuff, but not the vine work. Let me just finish by saying this. This is where Becky's material, Uncovering the Life of Jesus, has been amazing, because it's given people the questions, great inductive questions on a Bible study, so they can sit down and once they've got the Bible open, they can look at passages. The questions, you don't have to prepare for what happened with this material. This is the one that I use. You just slit it open and say, let's just read them together and go through. And so we've given people the materials to go through with their friends. But at my church, the vast amount of people, despite the fact we've run training, they've got the material, the vast amount of people are still not doing it with their friends. So that's the huge problem we've got. That the one issue I'm facing is, how do I mobilize this one-to-one amongst the church staff and the church family?
I'm going to ask one more question to Erik. By the way, surely, you intelligent people, there's follow-up questions in my mind that are coming up even as I'm listening to these answers, but you're the ones who have to pose those questions, and I think we can have a very fruitful discussion. Erik, one more area that's slightly different. A lot of us are pastors, and already hinted that most of us as pastors do feel much more sucked into everything else but personal evangelism. I mean, in other words, we're not going to get into personal evangelism unless we get into personal evangelism. Nobody's going to help us. There's no pressure to do it. There's no institutional pressure. Everything is pulling us in different directions. How do you, or do you, do it?
Yeah. Yeah, I think acknowledging the tension is helpful on the front end. The Apostle Paul tells Timothy to do the work of an evangelist. If we expect the people in the church to do evangelism, then the pastor should do evangelism as well. Obviously, leadership, we're to be an example for the flock as elders, as pastors, as 1 Peter says. So that's part of the calling as a pastor. So if a pastor's not doing evangelism, that's probably an indication that church members aren't doing evangelism. So I have to look hard in the mirror, think, how am I doing? How am I leading people? Because we are leading people. Are we leading them towards faithfulness and evangelism, or unfaithfulness and hypocrisy and evangelism? So just personally what I do, because I obviously wasn't always a pastor, so I had to struggle through these things as a guy who was just trying to live as a faithful Christian. So what I do is I look at the Apostle Paul, and one scene that is particularly encouraging to me is when, after he just gotten beaten up in Thessalonica and made his way up to Athens, and he was waiting for the rest of the crew to come up. And he, instead of just sitting back putting his feet up, Scripture says that he had his spirit provoked within him because the city was full of idols. So I just wonder, how does Paul get to the point where his spirit is provoked within him? How does he get to the point where he's so jealous for the glory of God that he has to go talk to people? So for me personally, I try to impress upon my own heart a deep sense and awareness of the beauty of God, the glory of God, and the fact that unbelievers are not glorifying God, they're robbing from God, they're taking His glory. And that's, on two levels, that should really trouble me. That should trouble me because I love God supremely, and He's not getting glory. Obviously, His intrinsic glory is not deflating, but the ascribed glory is not happening, and God desires worship, and that should trouble me as a Christian. But then also, I know that the people around me aren't giving Him glory, they're not enjoying and loving God, so that should trouble me because I love my neighbor. So you see, I'm pinched in on both sides. And so really a passion for the glory of God will compel faithful evangelism. And then also studying Christology. Jesus was the evangelist, right? The supreme evangelist. So how does Jesus interact with people? How can Jesus be so truthful yet so loving? Have such compassion on people, the lepers, the blind, but then you still at the same time feel a love towards the rich young ruler. So studying Christology has also been helpful. Another thing is just reminding myself that I was lost. I love how Paul does it in Ephesians. Chapter 1, the glorious inheritance that we have. Chapter 2, you were dead in trespasses and sin. You're not that special. And all those other people, they don't know Christ. You need to go tell them. You need to go talk with them. But God will raise lost people up. So God saves people. And then I think prayer. I forget who mentioned prayer. But obviously, part of our prayer work when we're praying evangelistically is slaying the idol of self. I mean, I'm convinced, as you said, Becky, that it's not the issue in evangelism is a God problem. All of Christianity ultimately comes down to a fear of man issue.
Exactly.
So whether you're talking about in one compartmentalized area or all across the board, we have to slay the idol of self, do the hard work in the closet, the prayer closet, putting self to death, so that we can be faithful in the public square, talking to people about Jesus. So then you pray for opportunities. Apostle Paul prayed for opportunities. Pray that I would be faithful, that I would be bold, that God would open a door for the word, and then confidently watch God work, knowing that He's the one who saves souls. And then you just get real practical about the day-to-day life. If you live with evangelistic intentionality, if you're praying, if you're putting self to death, suddenly you see all kinds of opportunities around you, and you want to make sacrifices to tell other people about Christ.
Yeah.
The questions are rolling in, and first one is a good one, actually, one I would have asked if you hadn't posed it. This is for Becky. Becky, so why would reading the Bible with non-Christian. If we're talking about postmodern people, very secular people, far away from Christianity, why is it the idea of seeker Bible studies? Why isn't there something else? Why reading the Bible with people? Why is that effective?
Great question. Let me go back for a second and explain something that Rico said, because I realize that we don't use the word courses here, and so I want to just explain something. There are, in our training, we say there are 3 things that we need to do for a church to become evangelistically vital. The foundation is prayer, but to become evangelistically vital, we absolutely have to have evangelism training on personal evangelism, motivating, encouraging, etc. Second thing, you need small group evangelism training. And this is, for us, it is, Dick and I do this seeker Bible study, and I'll get to that question. But then what would follow after doing a seeker Bible study where you're looking at Jesus is something like Christianity Explored. Do a small group where you're focusing on the person of Jesus, and then something that is actually a program. Thirdly, we need mission. When I was in student work, we did evangelistic outreaches all the time. That is much more the case now in the UK and Europe. I don't see it as much over here. Okay, we can talk about how do you do a good evangelistic mission, but after the mission, what they do in England then is then they give them now, because Uncovers become Uncovering the Life of Jesus. My seeker Bible studies sort of went viral. Now they're saying for follow-up, if they haven't been in the seeker Bible study when they went to the evangelistic outreach, that's what they follow up with, and then the course. Course meaning, well, in the UK, it'd either be Christianity Explored or Alpha. Those are the 2 basic courses. So that's what Rico means by course. Now, why seeker Bible study? Okay, we talk all the time, two answers to this. We talk all the time about wanting a God-centered approach to evangelism. All right, what we train people to do is say, you're having a great conversation about faith. You've done the incarnational work. You've got a friendship with somebody. They know that you really listen to them. You're really asking questions. And you're finding out what their questions are, more importantly. And so you've got a relationship. Then at some point, you need to say, your questions are really good, but I need to ask you something. Have you actually ever read the Bible as an adult? Have you ever looked, if you're a student, have you ever looked at primary source material? Always a great one for students. How can you make an intelligent decision if you have never examined what the documents are? What would you think about taking a look at a story of Jesus just to find out what Jesus is like just once? Let's just look one time. Now, what we find, and this is particularly in the global north, in secular cultures, Australia, America, and Europe, there's a lot of criticism of the church. A lot wouldn't darken the door of a church. They are curious about Jesus. And so they'll say, well, you're right. I really never, as an adult, have really seriously looked at who Jesus is. I'll do it. I'll do it once. They don't have to believe in the Bible. They don't have to believe in Jesus. They don't have to believe in God. It requires nothing. What happens? They then, and I always say, think of it like a book club. Only this time the book is on Jesus and who he is. What happens? The combination of the power of the Word of God, the power of the Holy Spirit to open eyes, Jesus comes alive. We have done this literally around the world. China, South America, Australia. What was so fascinating, you don't get more secular than Europe. Missiologists say it is the most secular and the hardest nut to crack for the gospel is in Europe. What did we find? We started on the student level. Everybody on the student said, yeah, okay, I'll do it. Got hooked. Jesus is irresistible. And they wanted to do it again and again and again. And then that first year, which was 2010, 2011, I think, they saw in the student world more professions of faith than they had seen in 15 years. That then clicked in Europe, and all the students went, we want to do this. It all started happening there. We want the training in evangelism, we want seeker Bible study, and then the churches came. What has been, now we're training churches in seeker Bible study. What is interesting, we do not find resistance to non-believers saying, I'd really like to take a look at this. I think it's interesting. I want to see. We think, what I always get feedback from Christians is Christians that, I thought the Bible was just for us. I had no idea it speaks to non-believers. Now, with the churches, what's been interesting is where people really quickly, the Christians, started doing seeker study, and where haven't they? All kinds of churches have implemented this and using it. What we find interesting, Rico and I, is that we did a big evangelism training conference at All Souls. And Hugh Palmer, the vicar, and Rico told me is, they're asleep in evangelism. We try so hard to get them going. They got real excited about the evangelism training, but they were resistant themselves about doing a seeker study. And the heartbreak is, non-believers are so open to being invited. Yeah. Rico said the way that he got now, there have been seeker studies, but he said the way he got most of them to do it is he said, I'll provide the non-Christian. Okay, what does that tell you? So, anyway, I think it is, we underestimate the power of the Word of God, and above all, the greatest shortcut to evangelism, apart from prayer and an incarnational relationship, the greatest shortcut, look at Jesus.
That's a good answer. And then, okay, still an unresolved question, but that wasn't, okay. Listen, let me move on to, this is a question for Erik. How can I evangelize well in a community that's spiritually secular but culturally Christian? Figure out what that, I think I know what that means.
Say it one more time.
Well, how do you evangelize well in a community that's spiritually secular but culturally Christian? I'm assuming, forgive me, questioner, but I'm going to interpret this. Those of us who are still in parts of America where it's still relatively culturally Christian, but we sense that it's been hollowed out. So there's still the trappings of going to church, but it's been much more hollowed out by secular narratives really operating in people's lives. So if people don't realize how secular they are, how do you evangelize them? I guess that's the answer. The question, I mean.
Yeah, we're experiencing that in Omaha. Many people might think Omaha kind of maybe the top of the Bible Belt there, but Omaha is becoming even an increasingly secular city. So the people that we talk to, I'd probably be second generation Christian influence. So they're, the people that we're interacting with and trying to talk to about the gospel would be culturally secular, but then still maybe have some gravitation towards Christianity. So I try to assume nothing with them. I try to listen for points of reference, but really I'm thinking more Mars Hill than the synagogue in the expression. So I try to build a framework for understanding things. Most of the time, I mean, it's almost like talking to a Mormon or a Catholic. I mean, if you're talking to someone who's secular, because they might have some of the furniture in the room, but it's tipped over, right? So sin. I know what sin is. No, you really don't. You don't know what sin is.
Yeah.
I know what grace is. No, And I'm not even correcting like that. I'm just asking questions and listening, and as they begin to talk about what they believe about Jesus, sin, the church, heaven, hell, judgment, the Bible, I'm beginning to hear a lot of things and find out that it is increasingly secular, and I want to fill in those potholes with the truth and build that framework. So what we find, a perfect example is the gym we go to. These guys, the trainers, I mean, they're in the people working out around us, me and another pastor that we go together. They're just so curious, and they ask us. They're coming up asking us questions and doing this, but they're not getting the pat answers that they're used to. So there's a curiosity, some of that attractiveness of just the gospel, because it's different, it's fresh water, it's fresh air. So I guess, in short, I would say assume nothing, Be as clear as you can. Ask a lot of questions, and be thoughtful.
Yeah.
Be thoughtful.
Yeah.
Try to be tactful, like Paul says. He proclaims him, admonishing everyone, teaching everyone with all wisdom. So there's the wisdom aspect to it. As part of that is, I think, is listening well and trying to answer well.
Yeah.
Right. Good, Eric. In other words, so you might say thoroughly secular people, the very idea of, or even the words sin and grace mean nothing, but we're talking about people who think they know what sin and grace are, but it's been redefined by secular narratives, and so you have to just not assume that. And it'd be a great mistake to assume that. Okay, that's helpful.
Can I just throw one in on that? I think in England, the stuff on idolatry has really helped us cut much more deeply. So sin has always been seen as law breaking. When the stuff came from the States on, look, your idols are the first two commandments, so what do you daydream about? What are your nightmares? What if it was taken away from you, would just kill you? You know, once we start doing that, people see how sin is, you get much more traction on sin. So I think it's as you're chatting with people, trying to ask the questions that make them go, oh gosh, yeah, you're right. There's something there I'm really hitting a roadblock with it.
So, Rico, this is a question for you. Though I would say that it seems like a little bit of a leading question. If I was a lawyer, I might get I might be guilty of that. So he says, evidently you said something that led the questioner to ask this. Is perhaps the issue we don't do a good job of teaching church members that we're supposed to count the cost of following Jesus? That if so, how can we correct that? It does sound like they're saying, it sounds like what you're saying is, look, we actually know what to do, and actually Becky's already said we know that non-believers are generally quite happy to sit down and read the Bible with you. And if the missing piece between the course and the event, if the missing piece is Christians being willing to stick their neck out, then how do you remedy that? Should we be actually going back and sort of saying, let's rethink what it means to be a Christian, or what it means to, so that sounds like you could turn that into a bit of a browbeating answer, but what is the best way to answer that question? Is that true?
Well, there's no doubt. When I put the Christian Explored material together, John Stott looked at the material and he said, move the whole day away that you do to before they become Christians so they count the cost. And he did a little study with me in Luke 14, before you go out to fight, make sure you know what you're up against before you build a house. And so we put that cost in, but nevertheless what we're used to in Britain is a benign culture. And now it's getting tough. Even though there are non-Christians that are hungry, you also might hit hostility, and you've got to say enough, and you don't know what you're going to get. So you've got to say something about judgment. You've got to say something about the uniqueness of Jesus, and you don't know what you'll get hit with. And the truth is, some Christians, a lot of our Christian church family, are getting hit very hard quite quickly, whilst others will find there's a real hunger. So you have to make sure you've got your identity in the grace of God really set in people. That's the key thing. It goes in here, but is it down in their heart? So whether you accept or reject me doesn't make me more valuable. What makes me valuable is Christ died for me. Now, unless I've got that in place, when I say something about the gospel that's got traction, for example, there is a judgment to come, you will face it. Christ has risen from the dead, and that's the promise, it's going to happen. Now, when you lay that before someone, it's amazing, and you don't know the answer. Some will say, no, look, I think that's true. And I need some more. Others will say, that's one of the most offensive things I've ever heard, and I hate you. and it's preparing people for both answers in a way that 15 years ago they would only really get, the guys of my age would go, look, probably Rico, you're right, and just, shut up because I want to live my own life. But there'd be a respect. There's not the respect now. So it's preparing people for hostility or preparing them for hunger, and they don't know what reaction they're going to get. And actually, that's the whole theme of the book that I've done, Honest Evangelism. It's saying you might get one or the other, but you've got to risk it. And they're only going to risk it if their identity is in the grace of God. So I don't know if that's much of an answer, but I think that's what
Can I add something to this?
Sure.
I really think it's why training in evangelism is so critical. Because what we're doing is we're preparing people, what Rico has said. For instance, one of the things we do in our training is, okay, what if you come to a hostile person and they're really hostile? What do you do? And well, one of the things that you can do is say, you seem to have a lot of energy. And I say, don't say you're so angry, but say, you seem to have a lot of energy around this. How could there be a good God when there's so much suffering? And can you tell me why? Yeah, my mom died when I was 8. Where was God? Okay, now we know something very important. It isn't just an intellectual question. There's a wound here. And so if we're preparing people, not just saying, yeah, you're going to meet hostility, but saying, why are they hostile? And how do we get around the hostility and find out? Another thing that's so important in the training is, oh my goodness, they're going to ask me a question I can't answer. Well, of course they are. They asked Jesus a question he couldn't answer. When are you returning? I don't know. My Father knows that. And I say, now, if Jesus was acting like we do, his response, that I don't mean this irreverently, but if he was responding like us, he'd go, oh my gosh, I don't know. That is so embarrassing. Just don't tell anybody, I don't know. And I go, if Jesus wasn't embarrassed, why are we embarrassed? Again, we need to go back to Jesus and look at how he dealt with so many different types of people. The other thing I want to say that's so important, and that is prayer. We need to be praying that God will guide us to people in whom he's already seeking. Nothing is more discouraging than continually knocking on the door of somebody who's closed. So we can do so much in training that prepare them. Do you know what the challenge is? Because we find that usually with the training, they get excited and go, I can do this. It's getting them to the training. Because everybody, you say the E word, and that's it. They go, oh, well, I'm sorry. I don't have the gift of evangelism. Thank goodness. So I'm not coming. And again, we say very few people have been given the gift of the evangelist.
Right.
But we're all called to be witnesses.
Yeah.
So how can we learn as the non-evangelist how to be a witness?
Tim, real quick.
Yeah,
just
Erik.
very briefly. Jesus did tell us to pray for evangelism. He actually says pray for laborers.
Yeah.
Right? So, and it's not, he doesn't say pray that the gospel would work, pray that God would get around to saving people. He says, pray for laborers. The harvest is plentiful.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
The laborers are few. So if you're a pastor or a church leader or just a Christian working hard in evangelism, modeling praying for faithful evangelism in your context.
Exactly.
And actually praying for faithful evangelism is actually a biblical thing to do.
Tim, tell us, what do you think, Tim, in terms of this mobilizing church family to do it? I mean, if you're, what would your...
Well, maybe some people have the gifts of evangelism, but almost everybody I know is unless Jesus brings them out of their temperament, they're either going to be, most people are too shy, they're afraid, they don't want to speak up. But I hear plenty of other people speaking up and doing a pretty unattractive job too.
Exactly.
And they just don't seem to know how to. They don't know how to gently draw people along. When they do open their mouths, well, why don't you believe that? I mean, they don't say it that way, but it's in their faces. So I don't know hardly anyone whose temperament is naturally makes them a good evangelist. So I actually sympathize a lot with the fact that none of you are going to be good at this unless Jesus helps you, because you're going to, if you just follow your natural temperament, you're going to screw it up.
Absolutely.
And with Jesus, if you're training people so that Jesus will bring them out of their temperament, what are the first things you're saying to facilitate that?
Well, I do that on almost virtually everything. It's also true in your marriage. I mean, in other words, your natural temperament is. I mean, the great thing I see about Jesus is that this sounds really strange. He kind of didn't have a temperament. A temperament is a habitual way. Like, you're an introvert and extrovert. It's a habitual way of dealing with things. So, like, for example, my wife's habitual way is speak first and then think later. And that's right. What she loves, we love to do things together, because she blurts it out, and 3 times out of 4 it's great. And And 1 time out of 4, it's not. And then I'm sitting back, and if the 3 times out of 4 is great, I'm sitting there, I'm thinking, and she knows I am. And then I'll supplement and make it better, or else I'll fix it. So we're a great team. And Jesus didn't have a temperament. He always, he didn't have a habitual way of dealing with things. He always was appropriate. Always appropriate, because he was perfectly wise. So what I try to explain that to people. Say you've got a habitual way of doing things. You're either your default mode is to defer, your default mode is to be quiet, or your default mode is to speak up. Your default mode is to confront. Your default mode is to comfort. Yeah. And you need to be asking Jesus to help you out of and to make you wise. Some of you are too, not really courageous, but you're confrontive, and some of you need to be courageous. So I'm sympathetic, but nevertheless, in the end, Rico, you do have to call people to say, on the basis of what he's done for you, you have to move people with what Jesus has done for you to say, you just can't keep your mouth shut. This isn't right. It's not fair. Look what he did for you. So anyway.
Can I just ask one more? When they get whacked, so they get hit, they've said something, they get hit back, perhaps not physically, but they get frozen out, they get isolated. And that may well be that interpersonally they've mucked things up a bit too, so the temperament has not helped. Mm-hmm. How do you put them back together?
Oh, well, I always, excuse me. Well, it's really great at this point to be a Calvinist. I just get my Calvinism out, and I say, you really can't screw up their life. You can't screw up your life. God's going to work through this. Yeah. He's humbling you right now. Please do not feel like, oh my goodness, if I could only take that back, or if I only, I lost that opportunity. I said, I'm sorry, you can't. In the end, yes, you're responsible for your behavior, and if you just did something wrong, you might need to apologize, or you can repent to God. If you did it wrong, you should repent to God. But don't sit around and think that somehow God's not using it, or not. He's using this in your life. He's using this in their life, and I get out all that Calvinism stuff, and it comforts people pretty much, I think.
I need to just add a little bit to this, and that is, I wouldn't agree that you have to become a different person, a different temperament, in order for God to use you. I think God really does use us the way we are. I always say in Europe, you don't have to be an extroverted American like me in order for evangelism to work. But I think one of the things that is very important that we aren't saying here, and that is there seems to be a thrust on, but how do I get the message out to them? When I think what we need to begin with is, how do I find out where are their points of resistance? Where is their pain? What are the questions they are asking? That's part of it. And also, God, give me the love of Jesus for this person. I'm going to tell you something. If you love people with the love of Jesus, you can almost break any communication rule in the book. I can remember years ago, a Christian student asked me to meet she wanted to introduce me to her non-Christian friend, and she said in front of this woman, all right, look, Becky, I'm leaving town. This is my friend. Her life is down the toilet. It's a mess. She is so messed up, but I want you to pick up where I left off. I thought, this is so embarrassing. She went away for a minute, and the non-Christian said, you know what? She really loves me, and it always shows. And I thought, oh, boy. So if we're expressing genuine love and care for that person, truly drawing them out, I find they do ask questions. Anyway.
Well, actually, and I think the time is about up, but a question is, somebody just asked this question. I was getting ready to read it, but actually we've been answering it. And it is a lot of times people feel there's a tension between building a deep relationship of friendship with a person and sharing the gospel. They feel there's a tension there. I think, Becky, we've just answered that a bit. Do any of do Rico or Eric want to add to that? Somebody who says, well, I'm building this relationship, and I feel like if I share the gospel, it's going to look to them like I'm just building the relationship in order to get a scalp here somewhere. So how do you navigate people? How do you help people feeling like there's a tension between sharing the gospel and being a friend?
I've just tried to be honest. Like, just tell people the most important thing in the world to me is Jesus Christ and what he has done for me. And you're my friend and I like you, but I have to be honest and tell you the truth about Jesus Christ, because it would be not very loving for me to not tell you. It would be hypocritical, and I just want to be honest, and I want to tell you. So, I mean, I've done that many times, and I mean, sometimes you'll get hey, I appreciate the honesty. I completely disagree with you, and then you move on to the next thing. But I don't think you really want to build a friendship on pragmatic, calculating superficiality.
Right.
I mean, that doesn't seem like much of a friendship worth preserving, especially if you're trying to build a good relationship.
And if it's going to go deeper, you've got to risk the pain line.
Yeah.
There's a pain line, and you can feel it coming up sometimes in a conversation as a preacher. You can feel it as you're speaking, and you've got to risk that, because that's what gives it depth either way. But you don't know if you're going to hit hunger or hostility when you're approaching that, and that's where you've got to be willing to sacrifice the friendship. It might be that they say, that was so offensive that I don't want you in my life. And that might happen.
But you can also say, every single time we do training, I go, how many of you are afraid of offending? Every hand goes up. I did this yesterday in a workshop. And then I said, okay, how many of you have said to the non-Christian, I am so excited about my faith, I really want to share it. I am worried I'm going to offend you. How many of you have said you're worried about offending? One hand went up in a room full of people.
Yeah.
Why doesn't it occur to us to be ourselves and to say, I really do care about you, I love the Lord, I want to share something with you, I am afraid of offending you, and I want you to know that. Usually what then they realize is you're normal. You're not just trying to push an agenda, you actually care. So there would be another.
It's very helpful.
This is for Rico. Obviously, nobody else is having any compunctions about jumping in on any one of these answers. But Rico, how do you counsel people who have had a series of gospel conversations and seen virtually no fruit at all? I mean, occasionally I talk to somebody who's really tried very hard for a year or two and had nothing but disappointments, and they're ready to give up.
Well, I just tell them that I tell them about my disappointments. I think they've just got to see me in the same arena. I mean, there's a guy called Yomi who's just along on my street, and we've been to the swings together with the kids, and we've been together, and we are good friends. And I said, look, do you want to look at the Bible? He said, no, not really. And I'd spent 2 years on the relationship, and we're still friends. We'll still go to the swings, but it was really tough, because I really thought he'd say, yeah, I'd like to look. And so I just share my own battle and my own disappointments, and I think that's where the church family just see that I'm alongside them on that. And the parable of the sower tells me there will be great disappointment. John the Baptist, he's running Christianity Explored for King Herod, and then he gets his head chopped off in the middle of it, which is disappointing.
Right. But you didn't have to counsel with him afterwards for being discouraged. He was just dead.
I think they're encouraged.
He was just dead.
I usually just say successful evangelism is faithful evangelism. Your job's not to bring the conversion. Your job's to faithfully give the gospel.
Absolutely.
So how do you do successful evangelism? Be faithful with it.
Yeah.
Okay, here's a question for Becky, and let me just lay it out. And there's another way to phrase this, but maybe I don't need to. So give us 3 or 4 ways that you could turn a conversation toward Christ. Let's say you're having a conversation with somebody, and there hasn't been, I think probably, hopefully you understand that in the beginning, if you're developing a friendship, you're just hoping that the conversation rather naturally or will just turn to Christ or Christianity or religion. There's a million ways it could happen. But let's just say it just hasn't happened. And you would like to take a little initiative. How would you do it, Becky?
One of the things that is important is understanding the use of questions in a conversation. First thing you need to find out is, what is this person's passion? What is their interest? What are they really passionate about? And we don't do this as a trick. We don't do it manipulatively. But we really ask questions. We're curious. We want to know. They're a doctor. Yeah, how did you get into medicine? What made you decide? What is your area of specialization? And again, this has to be sincere. If it's a trick, so you can slip in the gospel, it's not going to work. They can smell it. But as you're asking, let's use the example of a doctor. All right, so you're asking questions. One skill that we need is to ask the, how would I call it? The thought-provoking question, the issue question. For example, remembering now we're dealing with their area of interest. How do you give hope to patients who are terminal? All right, now we're dealing with their area of interest, but that's a thoughtful, reflective question. I find if you can ask that question, a God question really is pretty easy. Do you think it's possible that that this life isn't the only life? And we're talking about how do we get into conversations now. We're not talking about how do I then give them the gospel. I was talking to a student who was studying art in England, and this might have been America. Actually, I think it was America. And it was America. I said, "What's your major?" She said, "Art." I said, "What kind of art do you like? What do you do?" And she was telling me all the different things that she likes to do. And then I said, where do you think we get our ability to appreciate what is beautiful and what is ugly? I said, I had a biology professor at university, who began every lecture saying, man is nothing more than a meaningless piece of protoplasm, a fortuitous concourse of atoms. Every day, that's how we began the lecture. And I said, do you think a fortuitous concourse of atoms would have the ability to appreciate beauty? She said, I can't believe I've never asked myself that question. She said, I'm going to make a living at creating beauty, and I've never asked myself, where do we get that ability? She said, well, where do you think we get the ability? What do you think? And I said, do you think it's possible there is an invisible artist who created us from whence beauty comes? In other words, just asking questions about their area of interest can actually lead into a God question.
But there really aren't 3 or 4, questions that you can just have in the back of your mind that just always get you there. Basically, you're right. Questions that get to fundamental beliefs or fundamental issues of purpose, that sort of thing. That's a really great answer to the question, which is there are questions like that, but there's really not a set of 5 or 6 questions you could memorize and use. Otherwise, people will feel like you're basically a salesman and you're working through your protocols.
That's absolutely right. And they smell it.
And they smell it.
And therefore, have a great doctrine of creation. That's the key to this. If you're someone that celebrates life, you just enjoy it, you're interested, which comes out of our morning quiet time. We're thankful.
Right.
John Chapman, the Australian evangelist who so influenced me, it was just great being with him because he was fascinated by everything. Yeah. And he genuinely was. Yeah. My dad was in tobacco. He was fascinated by tobacco. I had a day with my father and I got them to play golf together, and my dad just said, well, I've just had he just asked me questions all day. And it's just Chapo was interested, even in smoking.
Yeah.
That is so true. That is so,
excellent.
So true.
And more could be said, but I have to hand it back to Brad.
Well, thank you all very much. If your question wasn't answered, Becky and Rico and Erik will be able to hang around for a bit more, and they're also going to be on the Good Book Company stand between 10:30 and 11 this morning, so you can come by and ask them their questions. Just wanted to encourage you all, the resources that they have been talking about, outreach with Erik Raymond, Christianity Explored is a course that Rico has founded. His book, Honest Evangelism, and Becky's Uncovering the Life of Jesus. And then also I just want to mention Tim's forthcoming book, Preaching, Communicating Faith in the Age of Skepticism, out in June. All great resources to continue to unpack the idea of evangelism and dealing it in this secular age.